Jake Martinez wiped the grease from his hands with an old rag and looked at the clock on the garage wall. It was almost midnight, but he wanted to finish fixing Mrs. Patterson's old pickup truck before calling it a night. The engine had been giving her trouble for weeks, and she needed it to drive to her doctor appointments in the next town over. Jake knew she didn't have much money, so he always tried to fix her truck as quickly and cheaply as possible. The small town of Cedar Falls, Nevada, was quiet at this hour. Most folks were already asleep, getting ready for another day of work or retirement activities. Jake lived alone in the house his father had left him, with the garage attached to the back where he fixed cars and trucks for anyone who needed help. He had been doing this work since he was a teenager, learning everything from his dad, who had run the same business for 30 years before him. Jake was tightening the last bolt on the truck's engine when the night sky suddenly turned bright green. He looked up through the garage's open door and saw something that made no sense at all. A ball of green fire was falling from the stars, getting bigger and brighter as it came closer to the ground. The thing was moving fast, much faster than any airplane he had ever seen. The sound hit him a few seconds later. It was like thunder, but deeper and longer, making the tools on his workbench shake and rattle. Jake stepped outside to get a better look, but the green fireball had already disappeared behind the hills that surrounded his small town. For a moment, everything was quiet again. Then the ground shook under his feet like a small earthquake. Jake was still staring at the hills when he heard the crash. It was the loudest sound he had ever heard, like a freight train hitting a mountain. His house shook so hard that he thought it might fall down. Car alarms started going off all over town, and dogs began barking everywhere. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of breaking wood and falling debris was coming from inside his own house. He ran to the front door and rushed inside. His living room looked normal, but when he got to his bedroom, he couldn't believe what he saw. There was a huge hole in his ceiling, and pieces of wood and insulation were scattered all over his bed and floor. But that wasn't the strangest part. In the middle of all the wreckage was a pile of twisted metal that glowed with a soft blue light. Jake grabbed a flashlight from his kitchen and went outside to see the damage from the yard. What he found made him question his own sanity. A long groove had been carved into his backyard, starting from the hills and ending at his house. The groove was filled with pieces of strange metal and what looked like broken crystals that sparkled in the darkness. At the end of the groove, right where it met his house, was the biggest piece of wreckage. It looked like part of some kind of vehicle, but unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The metal was smooth and curved, almost like it had been grown rather than built. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, glowing faintly with the same blue light he had seen in his bedroom. But as Jake moved closer with his flashlight, he saw something that made him forget all about the strange metal and glowing crystals. There was someone inside the wreckage. At first, Jake thought it might be a child because of the small size, but as he got closer, he realized this was no human child. The person had skin that looked silver blue in his flashlight beam, and their proportions were all wrong for a human. They were unconscious, maybe hurt badly, and they were wearing clothes made from the same strange material as the crashed vehicle. Jake's first thought was to call for help, but something stopped him. If he called the police or an ambulance, they would ask questions he couldn't answer. They would want to know what had crashed in his backyard, and Jake wasn't sure he believed it himself. This looked like something from a science fiction movie, not something that could really happen in Cedar Falls, Nevada. But the person in the wreckage was hurt, and Jake couldn't just leave them there. His father had always taught him that when someone needed help, you helped them first, and worried about everything else later. Jake carefully moved the twisted metal aside and checked to see if the stranger was still breathing. They were alive, but there was blood on their forehead, and their breathing was shallow. Jake gently lifted the unconscious figure from the wreckage. They were lighter than he expected, and their skin felt warm despite its strange color. He carried them inside his house and laid them down on his couch, then went to get his first aid kit from the bathroom. He had learned basic medical care from his time in the Army, and he knew how to clean wounds and check for serious injuries. As Jake worked on cleaning the blood from the stranger's forehead, he got his first good look at their face. They definitely weren't human, but they weren't scary or monster-like either. Their features were delicate and almost familiar, like a human face that had been slightly changed. Their eyes were closed, but Jake could see they were much larger than human eyes. Their hair was long and had the same silver-blue color as their skin. Jake finished bandaging the wound and sat back in his chair to think about what he should do next. He had an injured alien in his living room, and the evidence of their crashed spaceship was scattered all over his backyard. In a few hours, the sun would come up, and his neighbors would see the damage to his house and yard. They would ask questions, and some of them might call the authorities. The stranger stirred on his couch and made a soft sound like they were trying to speak. Jake leaned forward and saw that their large eyes were starting to open. When they focused on his face, Jake saw intelligence there, and something else. Fear. The alien tried to sit up but winced in pain and lay back down. Jake held up his hands to show he meant no harm and spoke in the gentlest voice he could manage. He told the stranger they were safe, that he wanted to help them, and that they were welcome to stay until they felt better. He didn't know if they could understand English, but he hoped his tone would let them know he was a friend. The alien's eyes never left Jake's face as he spoke. Slowly, some of the fear faded from their expression, replaced by curiosity and something that might have been gratitude. They tried to speak again, and this time Jake heard sounds that were almost musical, nothing like any human language he had ever heard. Outside, Jake could hear his neighbors starting to wake up and come outside to see what had caused all the noise. He knew he didn't have much time before someone came to check on him. He looked down at the injured alien on his couch and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Whatever this person was and wherever they had come from, they needed help, and Jake Martinez was going to make sure they got it. 3 days had passed since the crash, and Jake was starting to understand that his life would never be the same again. The alien, who had pointed to herself and said something that sounded like Zara, was recovering well from her injuries. Her cuts had healed much faster than any human wounds would have, and the strange blue glow under her skin seemed to get brighter as she felt better. Communication had been nearly impossible at first. Zara would speak in her musical language, and Jake would respond in English, and neither could understand the other. But on the second day, something had changed. A small device that looked like a piece of jewelry on Zara's ear had started working again, making tiny clicking and humming sounds. After that, she began to understand some of his words, and he could make sense of some of hers. The device, Jake learned, was called a universal translator. It had been damaged in the crash, but it was slowly repairing itself. Zara explained this through a mixture of broken English words and hand gestures, pointing to her ear and then to the wreckage outside. She seemed amazed that such a thing existed, but Jake was more amazed that she could fix it just by waiting. By the third day, they could have simple conversations. Zara told him that her people were called the Cathara, and they traveled between the stars in small family groups. She had been alone in her scout ship, mapping worlds that her people might want to visit when something had gone wrong with her engines. She had tried to reach the nearest planet, which happened to be Earth, but her ship had broken apart during the landing. Jake learned that Zara had been studying Earth for several days before the crash. She knew that humans lived here, and she knew they had cities and machines, but she had thought they were what her people called primitive. When Jake asked what that meant, Zara looked embarrassed and explained that it just meant early in their development, not stupid or bad. Her people measured how advanced a species was by how they treated their weakest members, not by their weapons or buildings. This made Jake think about his own town, and how everyone looked out for each other. Mrs. Patterson never had to worry about paying for her truck repairs because Jake knew she was living on a small pension. When old Pete Garrison had gotten sick last winter, the whole town had brought him food and helped with his grocery shopping. Maybe humans weren't as primitive. As Zara's people thought, Jake had his own questions about Zara and her world. He learned that the Cathara didn't build their technology the way humans did. Instead, they grew it using living materials that could think and repair themselves. This was why her translator was fixing itself, and why some of the wreckage in his yard still glowed with that blue light. The pieces were still alive in some way, trying to find each other and rebuild the ship. The first real test of their growing friendship came when Sheriff Danny Cooper knocked on Jake's door. Danny was a good man who had known Jake since he was a child, but he was also responsible for keeping the peace in Cedar Falls. Someone had reported the strange lights and sounds from 3 nights ago, and Danny was checking on everyone to make sure they were okay. Jake had prepared for this moment. He had moved all the glowing wreckage into his garage and covered it with old tarps and car parts. Zara was hiding in his bedroom with instructions to stay quiet no matter what happened. When Danny asked about the hole in his roof, Jake explained that a meteorite had crashed through it, and he was waiting for his insurance company to send someone to look at the damage. Danny seemed satisfied with this explanation, but he wanted to see the meteorite. Jake led him to the backyard and showed him a piece of the wreckage that didn't glow. It looked enough like a space rock to fool someone who wasn't looking too closely. Danny took a few notes and told Jake to call if he needed any help with the insurance company. After Danny left, Zara came out of the bedroom with tears in her large eyes. Jake was worried that she was hurt or scared, but she explained that she was crying because she was grateful. In her culture, lying to protect a stranger was considered one of the highest forms of honor. Jake had risked getting in trouble with his own people to keep her safe, and she would never forget that kindness. As the days passed, Zara began to explore Jake's world with the curiosity of a scientist. She was fascinated by his tools and wanted to understand how humans could make machines work without growing them. She watched him repair Mrs. Patterson's truck with the same attention that Jake might have given to a magic show. When he explained how the engine worked, she called him a metal singer, which was the closest her language could come to describing his skills. Jake found himself seeing his own work differently through Zara's eyes. He had always thought of himself as just a mechanic who fixed broken things, but Zara made him realize that he was doing something amazing. He was taking dead metal and making it come alive, giving it purpose and function. In her culture, people who could do this were highly respected. Zara was also amazed by human food and entertainment. She had never tasted pizza before, and she spent an entire evening watching Jake's old television and asking questions about every commercial and TV show. She was particularly interested in nature documentaries because they showed her parts of Earth that she hadn't seen during her brief survey from space. But it was the small things that seemed to impress her most. When Jake showed her a photograph of his father, she wanted to know why humans kept pictures of people who had died. This led to a long conversation about memory and love, and how humans dealt with loss. Zara's people had different customs, but she could understand the comfort that came from having something to remember a loved one by. Jake found himself talking about his father for the first time since the funeral 2 years ago. He told Zara about learning to fix engines in this same garage, about the pride in his father's eyes when Jake successfully repaired his first transmission, and about the loneliness he had felt since his father's death. Zara listened without judgment and told him that among her people, sharing such personal memories was a sign of deep trust. One evening, as they sat on Jake's front porch watching the sunset, Zara asked him about the other humans in his town. She had seen them from the window and noticed how they seemed to care about each other. Jake told her about the way Cedar Falls worked, how everyone knew everyone else, and how people helped their neighbors without being asked. This led to Zara sharing stories about her own people and their nomadic lifestyle. The Kethara traveled in small groups, usually family members, and they rarely stayed in one place for long. They had no permanent homes or cities, but they had strong bonds with their traveling companions. She had been alone on this mission because she was old enough to scout by herself, but she missed the company of her family group. As Jake listened to Zara's stories, he began to understand that she was as lonely as he was, just in a different way. She had the vast galaxy to explore, but she had no place to truly call home. He had a home and a community, but he had been living alone since his father's death, going through the motions of life without really connecting with anyone. Neither of them said it out loud, but both Jake and Zara were starting to realize that they had found something in each other that they hadn't even known they were missing. Jake was learning to see the wonder in his ordinary life, and Zara was discovering the comfort of belonging somewhere, even if that somewhere was a small garage in Nevada. The translator was working better each day, and their conversations became longer and more complex. They talked about everything from the differences between their species to their hopes for the future. Jake learned that Zara's people lived much longer than humans, and Zara learned that humans often formed strong emotional bonds with people who weren't related to them. By the end of the first week, Jake had stopped thinking of Zara as an alien who had crashed into his life. She was becoming something much more important than that. She was becoming his friend, and maybe something even deeper than friendship. He wasn't sure what the future would hold for either of them, but he knew that his life was better with her in it. 2 weeks after the crash, Jake's life had settled into a routine that felt both strange and natural at the same time. Every morning, he would wake up to find Zara already awake, sitting by the window and watching the sunrise with the same wonder she had shown on her first day. She would help him make breakfast, though her attempts at cooking human food often resulted in meals that were edible but unusual. Jake didn't mind, because he enjoyed watching her learn about his world. Zara had become fascinated with Jake's work in the garage. She would sit quietly on an old stool and watch him repair engines, asking questions about every tool and technique. Her interest made Jake feel proud of skills he had always taken for granted. When she called him a metal singer, he was starting to understand that she meant it as a high compliment. In her culture, people who could bring life to dead things were considered artists and healers. The universal translator was working perfectly now, and their conversations had become deep and meaningful. Jake learned that Zara's people believed in something called soul bonding, which was different from the romantic love that humans experienced. It was a recognition that two beings were meant to share their path through life, to protect and learn from each other regardless of their differences. Zara had not mentioned this concept casually, and Jake sensed there was a reason she had brought it up. The peaceful routine was shattered on a Tuesday morning when Jake saw a black car with government license plates driving slowly through town. He recognized the signs of federal agents, even though he had never dealt with them before. His time in the Army had taught him to spot law enforcement from a distance, and these people had that particular way of moving that said they were looking for something specific. Jake quickly went inside and told Zara to hide in the bedroom. She understood immediately and gathered up anything that might seem unusual to human eyes. The glowing pieces of her ship were still hidden in the garage, but there were small items throughout the house that could raise questions if the wrong person saw them. 20 minutes later, Agent Lisa Park knocked on Jake's door. She was a professional woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She showed Jake her identification and explained that the government was investigating unusual radiation readings that had been detected in the Cedar Falls area 2 weeks ago. She wanted to know if Jake had seen anything strange or unusual around the time of the readings. Jake had practiced this conversation in his head many times since Danny Cooper's visit. He told Agent Park about the meteorite that had crashed through his roof, and he showed her the same piece of wreckage that had satisfied the sheriff. He explained that he had been cleaning up the debris gradually and that his insurance company was handling the damage to his house. Agent Park was more thorough than Danny Cooper had been. She wanted to see the impact site in his backyard, and she had a device that made clicking sounds when she pointed it at different areas. Jake stayed calm and answered all her questions, but he could see that she wasn't entirely convinced by his meteorite story. The device clicked more frequently near his garage, and Agent Park asked if she could look inside. Jake's heart was beating fast, but he maintained his calm exterior. He told Agent Park that the garage contained sensitive customer information and expensive tools, and he couldn't allow unauthorized personnel inside without proper legal documentation. This was technically true, and it gave him legal grounds to refuse her request. Agent Park didn't like this answer, but she couldn't force her way inside without a warrant. After Agent Park left, Jake knew he was in trouble. She would be back, with legal paperwork that would allow her to search his property thoroughly. He had maybe a day or two before the government discovered Zara and her ship. He needed help, and he knew exactly where to get it. Jake had lived in Cedar Falls his entire life, and he understood how small towns worked. Within an hour of Agent Park's visit, he had made phone calls to 3 of his most trusted neighbors. He didn't tell them about Zara, but he told them that the government was harassing him about the meteorite incident and that he needed the community's help to protect his privacy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Pete Garrison, who had been suspicious of Jake's recent behavior, suddenly became his most vocal supporter. He spread the word that government agents were bothering one of their own, and the entire town began to rally around Jake. By afternoon, Agent Park found herself dealing with a coordinated campaign of polite non-cooperation. When she tried to interview other residents about unusual events, they had suddenly developed selective memory problems. Mrs. Patterson remembered the loud noise from 2 weeks ago, but thought it had been thunder from a storm that might or might not have actually happened. The owner of the local diner offered Agent Park free coffee and pie while giving her completely useless information about every mundane event in town history. Pete Garrison was particularly effective at wasting Agent Park's time. He cornered her, outside the post office and spent an hour telling her detailed stories about every unusual thing that had happened in Cedar Falls over the past 30 years. None of his stories had anything to do with what she was investigating, but he told them with such earnest enthusiasm that she couldn't politely escape. The most dangerous moment came when Agent Park returned to Jake's house with a warrant that allowed her to search his garage. Jake had spent the morning moving the most obviously alien pieces of wreckage to Pete Garrison's barn, but there were still some glowing fragments that he couldn't hide completely. As Agent Park approached the garage with her clicking device, Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. He led Agent Park on a deliberate wild goose chase through the desert hills behind his house. He claimed that most of the meteorite fragments had scattered in that direction, and he offered to help her search for them. Jake knew these hills better than any outsider ever could, and he led Agent Park to every empty canyon and dry creek, bed in a 5-mile radius. By the time they returned to town, she was exhausted, frustrated, and no closer to finding what she was looking for. That evening, as Jake sat on his porch trying to calm his nerves, Zara came outside and sat beside him. She had watched the day's events from the bedroom window, and she had seen how the entire town had mobilized to protect someone they cared about. In her culture, this kind of community loyalty was rare and precious. Her people were nomadic by choice, but humans had created something different. They had built families out of geography and shared experience. Zara told Jake that she had been thinking about the concept of home and what it meant to different species. The Cathara carried their homes with them in their ships and in their family bonds. They belonged to the journey itself rather than to any specific place. But humans had created something that her people had never achieved. They had learned to extend family bonds to anyone who needed them, to protect strangers who became neighbors, and neighbors who became family. As they talked, Jake realized that Zara was trying to tell him something important. She spoke carefully about the soul bonding that her people believed in, explaining that it was not something that happened often or casually. When two beings recognized that they were meant to share the same path, it created a connection that transcended species, distance, and time. She had felt this connection the moment Jake had carried her broken body into his house, and every day since had only made the feeling stronger. Jake had never heard the term soul bonding before, but he recognized the feeling Zara was describing. Over the past 2 weeks, she had become more than just a friend or a house guest. She had become essential to his happiness in a way that he couldn't fully explain. When she watched him work, he felt like the most skilled mechanic in the world. When she asked questions about his life, he found himself remembering good times. He had almost forgotten. When she smiled at his jokes, he felt like the funniest person alive. But more than that, Zara made him feel like he belonged to something larger than himself. For 2 years since his father's death, Jake had been going through the motions of life without really living. He had been fixing other people's problems while ignoring his own loneliness. Zara had changed that by showing him that his ordinary life was actually extraordinary when seen through different eyes. That night, Jake finally admitted to himself what he had been trying to deny. He didn't want Zara to leave, not just because he enjoyed her company, but because she had become part of who he was. The thought of going back to his old routine, of working alone in the garage and eating dinner by himself, seemed unbearable now that he had experienced something better. Zara seemed to understand his thoughts without him having to say them out loud. She told him that her people believed the soul bond was mutual, that both beings had to recognize and accept the connection. She had been waiting to see if Jake felt the same way she did, and his actions during the day had given her the answer. When the entire town had rallied to protect him, and when he had risked his own safety to keep her hidden, she had seen the kind of person he truly was. As they sat together under the stars, both Jake and Zara understood that their relationship had moved beyond friendship into something deeper. 1 month had passed since Zara crashed through Jake's ceiling, and life in Cedar Falls had developed a rhythm that felt both natural and impossible. Agent Park had returned twice more with different equipment and more warrants, but the town's campaign of helpful unhelpfulness had continued to frustrate her efforts. She was clearly suspicious that something was being hidden from her, but she couldn't prove anything concrete enough to justify a larger investigation. Meanwhile, Zara had been receiving weak signals from other Cathara vessels. Her people were looking for her, and eventually they would find her. The signals were still too faint to establish real communication, but they were getting stronger each day. Both Jake and Zara knew that their time together was limited, but neither wanted to talk about what would happen when her rescue finally arrived. Zara had begun contributing to the community in ways that amazed everyone, though they didn't understand how she did it. Her knowledge of advanced materials and energy systems helped Jake perform repairs that should have been impossible. Engines that were completely worn out began running like new after Zara quietly applied some of her people's techniques to their repair. Word spread quickly through the region that Jake's garage could fix anything, and people started coming from 3 counties away to have their vehicles serviced. Jake found himself busier than he had ever been, but also more satisfied with his work. Zara's presence had transformed his simple garage into something that felt almost magical. She couldn't use her people's living technology on Earth, but she could guide Jake's hands to make ordinary tools accomplish extraordinary things. Together, they were fixing problems that individual human mechanics would have declared hopeless. The town had fully embraced Zara without ever being formally introduced to her. They left small gifts on Jake's porch, fresh vegetables from Amy Nelson's garden, books from the library that Carol Stevens thought might interest the mysterious woman living with Jake, and even a hand-knitted scarf from the church ladies group. Nobody asked direct questions, but everybody made it clear through their actions that Jake's friend was welcome in Cedar Falls. This acceptance meant more to Zara than Jake initially understood. Her people were nomads who rarely stayed anywhere long enough to form deep community bonds. The idea that an entire town of strangers would adopt her based solely on Jake's word was something she had never experienced before. She began to understand why humans could create such strong civilizations despite their relatively short lives. They had learned to extend trust and protection beyond blood relationships. During quiet evenings, Jake and Zara talked about the future with a mixture of hope and dread. Zara described the wonders she had seen during her travels with her family group. There were living cities that grew in the hearts of stars, creatures made of pure energy that sang planets into existence, and ancient civilizations that had transcended physical form entirely. The galaxy was full of marvels that Jake could barely imagine. But she also described the loneliness of constant travel, the ache of never staying anywhere long enough to truly belong. Her people valued the journey more than the destination, and they found meaning in discovery and exploration. This was a beautiful way to live, but it came with the cost of never having a permanent home or stable community. Zara had accepted this as the natural way of life until she experienced what it felt like to be part of Jake's world. Jake, for his part, tried to imagine what it would be like to leave Earth and travel among the stars. The idea terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. He had never been more than a few hundred miles from Cedar Falls, and the thought of seeing other worlds was almost too big to comprehend. But the thought of losing Zara was even worse than his fear of the unknown. They both knew that difficult choices were coming. When Zara's people finally arrived, she would have to decide whether to return to the nomadic life she had always known or to stay on Earth with Jake. And Jake would have to decide whether to remain in the only home he had ever known or to leave everything familiar behind for a life among the stars. The decision became more complicated when Zara explained the realities of interspecies relationships among her people. The Cathara had encountered many different species during their travels, and they had learned that successful partnerships between different kinds of beings required careful consideration. The differences in lifespan alone could create heartbreak, since Zara's people lived much longer than humans. There were also questions about where such a couple could live and how they could raise children if they chose to have them. But there were also precedents for such relationships. The Cathara respected the concept of soul bonding above all other considerations, and they had accepted interspecies partnerships when the connection was genuine and strong. Zara's family group would need to meet Jake and evaluate their relationship, but they would not automatically reject it based on species differences alone. As the signals from Zara's people grew stronger, Jake began preparing for both possibilities. He taught Zara more about human culture, showing her movies and music that captured the best of what his species had to offer. She was particularly drawn to stories about exploration and discovery, seeing parallels between human adventurers and her own people's wandering nature. She also loved human music, especially the songs that told stories about home and family and belonging. Jake also began learning about the galaxy from Zara's perspective. She taught him about the different species her people had encountered, the various forms that life could take on different worlds, and the complex relationships between civilizations that had developed across thousands of years. The more he learned, the more he realized how much there was to discover beyond Earth's boundaries. The town, meanwhile, had noticed changes in Jake that they couldn't quite explain but definitely approved of. He was happier than anyone had seen him since his father's death. He smiled more, laughed more, and seemed to take genuine pleasure in his work and his relationships with his neighbors. Whatever was going on with the mysterious woman in his house, it was clearly good for him. Pete Garrison, who had become Jake's unofficial protector during Agent Park's visits, finally cornered him one evening and asked direct questions. He wanted to know if Jake was in any kind of trouble and if there was anything more the community could do to help. Jake was touched by the old man's concern, but he couldn't tell him the whole truth without putting everyone at risk. Instead, Jake told Pete that he had found someone special, someone who understood him and made him want to be a better person. He said that there might be complications in the future, and he might need the community's support for decisions that would seem strange to outside observers. Pete accepted this explanation and promised that Cedar Falls would stand behind Jake, no matter what choices he made. This conversation made Jake realize how much his community meant to him. These people had supported him through his father's death, helped him build his business, and now they were protecting him from government interference without even knowing why. The idea of leaving them behind was almost as difficult as the idea of losing Zara. But Jake also realized that Zara had taught him something important about the nature of family and belonging. The bonds that mattered most weren't necessarily the ones based on blood or geography. They were the ones based on choice, on mutual respect and support, on the decision to care about someone else's well-being as much as your own. Cedar Falls would always be his home, but home could be something that traveled with him if he chose to follow his heart. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset from Jake's front porch, Zara told him about a Cathara concept called expanding circles. Her people believed that love and loyalty should grow outward from the self to family, then to community, then to species, and finally to all life in the galaxy. Most beings never got past the first few circles, but the greatest among her people were those who could care about strangers as much as they cared about themselves. Jake had demonstrated this kind of expanding love from the moment he found her, in the wreckage of her ship. He had risked his safety for a complete stranger, then extended that protection to include his entire community's support. This was exactly the kind of person that the Cathara respected most, and Zara knew that her family group would see these qualities in him when they finally met. As the signals from space grew stronger each day, both Jake and Zara knew that their quiet month together was coming to an end. The choices that would determine the rest of their lives were approaching fast, and they would need to be ready to make decisions that neither of them could fully predict. But they also knew that whatever happened, they had found something in each other that would last forever, regardless of distance or time or the vast differences between their species. The rescue ship arrived on a Tuesday morning like a silver teardrop falling from heaven. Jake was in his garage working on Mayor Betty Richards' car when the shadow passed over the building, moving too slowly and too quietly to be any aircraft he recognized. He stepped outside and looked up to see something that took his breath away. The Cathara vessel was beautiful in a way that human ships could never be. It looked grown rather than built, with curves that flowed like water and surfaces that seemed to shift color in the morning sunlight. It settled silently in the desert outside town, touching down with the gentleness of a soap bubble landing on grass. Jake stood frozen for a moment, knowing that the most important day of his life had just begun. Zara appeared beside him, having heard the ship's approach from inside the house. Her large eyes were bright with emotions that Jake couldn't read, a mixture of joy and sadness and something else that might have been fear. She had been waiting for this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, she seemed as uncertain as Jake felt. 3 figures emerged from the ship and walked toward them across the desert sand. They moved with the same fluid grace that Jake had, learned to associate with Zara, and they all had the same silver-blue skin and large eyes. But there were differences, too. The leader was taller than Zara and carried herself with obvious authority. The other 2 seemed younger, and they looked around at the human settlement with open curiosity. Zara walked forward to meet them, and Jake followed a few steps behind. He could hear them speaking in the musical language of the Cathara, and he caught his own name several times in their conversation. The translator device in Zara's ear would let her understand what they were saying, but Jake had to wait for her to explain what was happening. After several minutes of rapid conversation, Zara turned to Jake with tears in her eyes. She introduced him to Captain Kess, who was her cousin and the leader of their family group. The other 2 were Kess's children, both younger than Zara, but old enough to serve as crew members on their exploration vessel called Wandering Star. Captain Kess stepped forward and spoke to Jake in carefully pronounced English. She had learned some human languages during her travels, and she wanted to thank him personally for saving Zara's life and caring for her during her recovery. She had expected to find a stranded scout eager for rescue, but instead she had found Zara integrated into an alien community and reluctant to leave. Jake responded with the same careful politeness, thanking Captain Kess for coming to find Zara and telling her that it had been an honor to help someone in need. He tried to keep his voice steady, but inside he was struggling with emotions he couldn't control. These people had come to take Zara away, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. But Captain Kess surprised him by asking questions that had nothing to do with immediate departure. She wanted to know about Jake's work, about his relationship with Zara, and about the human community that had protected them both. She listened carefully to his answers, and Jake got the impression that he was being evaluated for something he didn't understand. Zara's younger cousins were fascinated by the human settlement and asked permission to explore the town. Jake offered to show them around, and they spent the morning visiting his garage, meeting some of his neighbors, and learning about how human communities functioned. They were particularly impressed by the way everyone seemed to know and care about each other despite not being related by blood. That afternoon, Captain Kess asked to speak with Jake privately. They walked together to the top of a small hill overlooking Cedar Falls, and she explained the situation from the Cathara perspective. Zara had told her family about the soul bond she felt with Jake, and they took such things very seriously. Among her people, the recognition of a true soul bond was rare and sacred, and it was never dismissed lightly. But there were practical considerations that had to be addressed. Jake was human, with a human lifespan and human needs. Zara was Cathara, with a much longer life expectancy and a nature that was suited to travel between the stars. Even if their emotional connection was genuine, there were questions about whether such a relationship could work in the long term. Captain Kess wanted to know what Jake hoped for in this situation. Did he expect Zara to abandon her people and her nature to live a human life on Earth? Did he understand what it would mean for her to give up the travels that had shaped her entire existence? Or was he prepared to leave his own world behind and join the Cathara in their journey through the galaxy? Jake had been thinking about these questions for weeks, but hearing them stated so directly made him realize how difficult the choice really was. He told Captain Kess that he wanted whatever would make Zara happiest, even if that meant letting her go. He had no right to claim ownership over her choices, and he wouldn't ask her to sacrifice her nature for his comfort. This answer seemed to satisfy something in Captain Kess's evaluation of his character. She told Jake that among her people, the willingness to put another's well-being above one's own desires was considered the highest virtue. Most beings, even those who claimed to love someone, ultimately wanted to possess and control their partners. Jake's acceptance of Zara's autonomy marked him as someone worthy of serious consideration. But Captain Kess had another surprise for Jake. She told him that the Cathara had been discussing the possibility of establishing more formal contact with humanity. Earth was at a crucial point in its development, and her people believed that humans had qualities that could benefit the galactic community. They were looking for someone who could serve as a bridge between species, someone who understood both human and Cathara perspectives. If Jake was willing, he could join their expedition as Zara's bonded partner and as humanity's first informal ambassador to the stars. He would travel with their family group, learning about the galaxy while helping other species understand human nature and values. It would mean leaving Earth for extended periods, but it wouldn't mean abandoning his home forever. Jake was overwhelmed by the offer, but he knew he couldn't make such a decision alone. That evening, he called an emergency town meeting at the community center. He couldn't tell his neighbors about aliens and spaceships, but he could tell them about an opportunity to represent their community and their values to a wider world. The meeting was packed with everyone Jake had known since childhood. He explained that he had been offered a chance to travel as a cultural ambassador to show other people what life was like in places like Cedar Falls. It would mean being away for months or years at a time, but it would also mean sharing their values of community support and mutual aid with people who had never experienced such things. Mayor Betty Richards was the first to speak, and she surprised Jake by saying that he was too valuable to lose, but too good to hold back. If someone wanted to learn about the best of human nature, they could do worse than studying Jake Martinez and the community that had shaped him. She said that Cedar Falls would be proud to have him represent them, as long as he promised to come back and visit regularly. Old Pete Garrison, who had become Jake's strongest supporter during the government investigations, stood up and delivered what amounted to a speech. He said that Jake had spent his whole life taking care of broken things and broken people, and it was time for someone to take care of him for a change. He didn't care if Jake's girlfriend was from Mars or Michigan. She made him happy, and that was enough for the people of Cedar Falls. The unanimous support of his community gave Jake the confidence to make his choice. The next morning, he told Captain Kess that he would be honored to join their expedition, but only if they could establish Cedar Falls as a regular stop on their travels. He wanted to maintain his connection to his home while building bridges to the rest of the galaxy. Captain Kess agreed to this arrangement, seeing the wisdom in having a permanent base where Cathara vessels could resupply and where other species could learn about human culture. Cedar Falls would become the galaxy's first human-alien cultural exchange center, a place where anyone could find help, friendship, and decent coffee regardless of which planet they came from. The solution satisfied everyone's needs. Zara would continue traveling with her family group, but she would have a permanent home base where she belonged. Jake would see wonders beyond his imagination, but he would never have to permanently abandon the community that had shaped him. And the people of Cedar Falls would become part of something larger than themselves, while remaining exactly who they had always been. 6 months later, Jake's garage had expanded into a small spaceport where vehicles from a dozen different worlds came for repairs and maintenance. Zara had become the town's unofficial alien ambassador, teaching curious humans about life among the stars while learning about Earth customs and traditions. And the people of Cedar Falls had discovered that their values of hospitality and mutual support worked just as well with aliens as they did with their human neighbors. Agent Lisa Park had eventually given up her investigation, unable to prove that anything unusual was happening in Cedar Falls, despite mounting evidence that something extraordinary was going on. The town's reputation for helpful unhelpfulness had become legendary among federal